Good afternoon. This is Rhonda Caldwell from Hamden Action Now, and it's also Justin Farmer's Just in Time Community Conversation. We have an awesome guest today by the name of Aaron Eisenberg. He's with the Public Power Campaign out of New York. We are so excited to talk to him today. Actually, Justin Farmer is going to be talking with him about all of the projects they're working on in their power campaign out in New York. So stay tuned, and it'll be a very interesting conversation.
Hey, Aaron, how are you?
Hey, Justin. Good. I'm doing really well. I'm really glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Just to do a little introduction, uh, these just-in-time conversations started this series to really just share with people all the work that other people are doing and different facets that, we don't really think about or know about. Um, and somehow we got connected when I was running for state senate. But I'm really excited. Some people have heard me walk out about this before, but I am very interested in CCA, community choice aggregation. So I invited Aaron to kind of share the work that's happening in New York. If you could just, Aaron, how did you come to the work of democratizing energy? Like, what brought you into this?
Yeah, and thanks for having me, Justin. And so I guess and I think Alex connected us when you were running, and Alex, as you know, is a big democratization guy into all those kind of plans. And so we've talked about and geeked out about it as well. I got into energy kind of a roundabout way. It was kind of the last thing where I was someone who was interested in climate. I was someone who was interested in racial justice. I was someone who was interested in economic justice, and I was interested in climate and working on climate issues and transit, any of these mobility issues that are connected to it, and cities. And generally, when we think of cities, we think of transit, we think of ways people get around, but the largest emissions always comes from buildings in New York City, but generally through their energy usage. And it's how we the grid controls everything. And if you don't go after the belly of the beast, you don't go after the main thing, you're not really you're kind of working around the problem. And so I'm part of New York City DSA Eco-Socialists, and we, in 2019 or 2018, we started a energy democracy public power campaign. And it was in thinking at the time, like, we have Con Ed, who's a for-profit monopoly utility and has been, and we have National Grid for gas, and New York's energy system is owned by these for-profit corporate monopolies. They're given a monopoly status in exchange for providing service, but they make decisions on the basis of profit. Their goal isn't to run a good system. It's to squeeze as much money as possible from us. And so New York City, we're charged the second highest municipal rates in the country for service that, with shutoffs all the time, crumbling infrastructure, we have blackouts all the time in New York, and there's nothing really you can do about it. If you go back to so Governor Cuomo in New York is our governor, our disgraced and embattled governor, who should resign if he has any sensibility, in my view. But you go back to Governor Cuomo, he's been in office now for over 10 years, or just about 10 years. And like clockwork, every year there's a major storm. Governor Cuomo comes out and says, these utilities have to do better. They have to do better, and then kind of threatens them. If they don't, someone else will. But because they're monopolies and they make over $1 billion in profits each year, wow, they just kind of get off scot-free. And the CEO makes $8-9 million a year. They can raise their rates. And like the best thing we got as the public was 1 year kind of after doing as horribly as they've always done, weren't allowed to raise rates for 2 more years. 2 years later, they were able to raise rates again, and they raise them every time they can. They get to raise rates. It's kind of a thing. But so we came together and we were like, this is not right. This is not the way it should be. And New York State is right now at only 5% wind and solar total. We're supposed to, we have these ambitious climate law and mandate that we passed in 2019 called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, CLCPA, which mandated 70% by 2030 and 100% by 2040. Those are really good targets. But when we're only at 23% hydropower and 5% wind and solar, so about 28%, we're very far from that 70% and 100% that we need to get to. And there wasn't really a plan in place for it. And so our public power campaign kind of came out of that with the twofold understanding that the private utilities are not doing their job. They're really not helping anyone. They think they're invincible. There's nothing really that can be done about them, but also that we're not in any place to meet our climate challenge. And so we started the campaign there to kind of say there has to be an alternative. There has to be something better. We need something for the public, by the public, in energy. Like there's no reason that we should be getting extorted by these private utilities and also not getting 100% renewable energy or clean energy. That we're getting dirty energy, we're getting poisonous pipelines going through our communities, and we're paying the highest rates in the country, second highest rates in the country for that, while they're making $1.3 billion in profits every year. That sounds like a missed situation where that money can be reinvested into our communities, into our grid, into resiliency efforts, and reclaim our power and really take it back over. And so that's when the kind of campaign started. We had actually started by getting involved in a Con Ed rate case as a party in it. And so we had thought, okay, perhaps this is something we can fight back on. And we were a party in a rate case, which is a process that happens once every 3 years, where they say, Con Ed comes to the table and says, right now we have this amount of money, we make this amount of money, and we want to raise rates 20% for the next 4 years. Or we want to raise rates 13% for the next 3 years. And then their lawyers are paid for by rates, by the ratepayers that you and I paying. They have funds in that contract that they've put in for strike breaking funds. They have funds in there for all these awful and bad things. And then the public can perhaps be a party. It was a really arcane process. We were a party. And we have to pay for our own travel. We have to pay for times that we take off. There's no money for the ratepayers that go into that. And then by the end of it, Con Ed won. They won 14% rate increase over the next 3 years. And we really couldn't do anything about it. And so that was when we really started getting to thinking, okay, if this system is the way it's set up here, we need to be providing an alternative. And that's where the public power campaign really got legs from, saying like, okay, this current private utility model is not working. We need a publicly owned, democratically controlled, 100% renewable energy system for our communities and to take our power back. And so that's kind of how we went about it, and in thinking about how we can build out a campaign. And then we started in New York City, and then realized that this is not just a New York City fight. This is not just something that's happening in New York City, and we can't think of New York City on an island. So we formed a statewide coalition, and we have groups all across the state that are now fighting for energy democracy and fighting for a publicly owned, democratically controlled, 100% renewable New York that we need.
No, that I am a co-chair for the Central Connecticut DSA, that's Democratic Socialists of America. We're doing the work, we're putting it in. Just for Connecticut people, for context, this is similar to EverSource. Our big energy conglomerate is EverSource. They've done hikes. In fact, this last summer we had a major storm, knocked down hundreds of trees. People were without power for days on end during blistering hot days. And Eversource, just before that, they were approved for rate increases. And part of that, of the penance of some of the elected officials talking tough to Eversource, they said, we're going to do a freeze on rates for 2 years. So I'm just like, wow, this is like boilerplate. Like, oh, okay, you guys are upset. We're doing a bad job. I guess we won't raise rates for 2 years. I guess.
And
I
do you also have a Vanguard in Connecticut too, for Connecticut natural gas, or because I know that I think so. There's a Spanish multinational company called a Vanguard, which is like this major energy company that not only, I think New Haven might be a Vanguard. One of these cities is a Vanguard, and they also own Rochester's energy system. They also own PSEG, which is in like central and southern tier of New York. They own NYSEG, another one in New York State. And so, or PSEG's on Long Island, NYSEG's in the southern tier. But so like they are this energy company, multinational conglomerate that's not based in your community. They don't really have any care for your community. And they're what is their goal? To increase shares for the ratepayers, or for their shareholders, not for the ratepayers. And so that's why they're raising the rates all the time, right?
Well, and when we talk about things like that, one of the big things I've started to push on and expand people's mind on is, the grid. Who's on the grid? How do we determine how the grid works?
Mm-hmm.
And resiliency. What does that resiliency look like? Just 2 miles down the street from me is Yale University, one of the wealthiest institutions on the planet. Endowment, $33 billion. The university has its own power plant. It literally has a separate grid from the rest of the city.
And they built it recent. I remember from talking to Alex about this, because they built it recently, I think in like 2013 or 2014, but they built a natural gas facility, like a LNG facility, because even with all those 33 billion in endowment, they didn't want to build out the renewables, right?
Yeah, and the excuse that I've heard from some higher ups in Yale was that the cost, to which I was just like,
yes, the cost.
I'm just like, you do realize you have the money, well, the materials, and just like, again, if you have that much money, like, I don't think you're gonna have a hard time getting solar panels. And I think this is part of the conversation of just like educating people, where when I put it to people that the university has its own power plant and it creates its own energy, but the street lights, because the university is like 2/3 of the city, the street lights, that is the taxpayers' dollars that's not coming from the university or its power plant. People are like, whoa, hold on. I'm like, yes. Like, that's what I mean, is that, one, just sustainability, like, that doesn't make sense. But two, how our energy is created. So, if you can talk a little bit more about, the process, because I think.
Sure. That's I think so. Like you said, Justin, this is something that like is intentionally made difficult and supposed to be tricky, so people don't have an understanding and just accept whatever their bill is 1 month to the next. It's so energy in the most basic form is broken down into 3 different parts: generation, transmission, and distribution. I'll try to be as simple on this as possible. Generation is literally a large hydroelectric plant or a power plant that you've seen here. You see the smokestacks coming out. That's a power plant. That's where energy is created, generated, and generation is where it starts. Then transmission is bringing it from that source. And generally, these are along the highways. You see those giant cables running along the highways and transmitting that energy, and that's transmission, from a power plant to a distribution hub. And then from a distribution hub, which is a distribution utility and a smaller plant, that's when it comes to you in a energy source that you can turn on your lights at home or kind of plug in something in your home or keep the lights on in the city, and that's distribution lines. And distribution infrastructure is, in New York's context, and I think this is really important for understanding, transmission and generation in New York are separated from distribution. This happened in the 1990s, and this was something that we actually was a national trend. It is something called deregulation in this way, and is something that we saw in Texas actually a couple of weeks ago, which was the model based off of Enron in California. When Texas a month or two ago had that giant rolling blackouts and giant mess, and really a breakdown of their entire grid because of the fossil fuels that couldn't be transported because of it being too cold. That was all because of this 90s deregulation that happened on energy that was supposed to create these vertical integrated markets that never actually came. And so as a result, New York State adopted this where Con Ed or National Grid in New York City cannot have their own power plant and supply energy. That has to come from somewhere else. They're just distribution. They are just a middleman. And so in the way we think about it in New York State, why should a distribution utility be making $1.3 billion a year if they're not even creating the energy? They're literally just distributing it. And that's not $1.3 billion a year. And I keep coming back to that number, but that's been for 60 years straight that they've made billions in profits. They're called on Wall Street, they're like one of the safest bets viewed as this, and one of the places because they just continually have this. They have guarantees from the state to have energy and to be able to distribute it. And so if you're monopoly status in New York City, you're doing pretty good. And so as a result, like we see that and we say that doesn't make sense. We also see, and excuse me, I'm just going to take a sip of water first. Mm-hmm. We also saw an opportunity. So like, I know you've talked about CCAs, and we'll get into that in Connecticut because it makes a lot of sense for Connecticut. In New York, we have the largest state-owned public utility in the country, Power Authority. The New York Power Authority was created actually by FDR when he was the governor of New York in 1931. This is before he became president. He created this Power Authority, and it has mainly large-scale hydroelectric facilities on the Niagara River and St. Lawrence River. Right at Niagara Falls, there's a giant facility. It is which generates the most hydroelectric electricity east of the Mississippi River. And on a peak day, NYPA, the New York Power Authority, just through these facilities, generates 1/4 of New York's peak demand for energy. Wow. And it's 83% renewable already, because it's mainly just their hydro facilities. So if it's already doing 1/4 of New York State's energy and is 83% renewable with already a goal for 100% renewable, they're going to shut down their peaker plants that they have too, and have worked with environmental justice communities to implement battery storage ideas. That's a public utility doing that where the private utilities are not. They also have 1/3 of the transmission infrastructure across New York State. They own it already, and that's all owned by the state. It's doing really well, and they have billions in their kind of back because they can issue bonds and pay these projects over many years. So that's NYPA. But the problem is NYPA is not allowed to scale up. What New York State chooses instead to do is have NYPA do public-private partnerships or do a project where the largest solar project in New York State is owned and operated by Goldman Sachs. And is a project that it's like comical in a way, where it's Goldman Sachs Renewable Energy partnering with NYSERDA and NYPA to bring the new energy to New York State. And so we looked at that and we were like, why should Goldman Sachs be profiting off this? A lot of it is kind of, why are these people the ones that are profiting off of this? And so what we saw was, and this is something that I'll talk shortly about, but like, we have a bill this year called the New York Build Public Renewables Act. And this bill is A1466A in New York State. And the Build Public Renewables Act does this. It says NYPA should be able to scale up. It says NYPA should have the right of first offer and refusal on any new utility scale project. It already does this. So it says 60 days they make a decision. Do we want this project or not? And can we scale up the renewables in a way to meet our 2030 targets and 2040 targets? And it says like that we should have public power as an option. It should be a public option where by 2025, it's going to supply all state and municipal owned properties with 100% renewable energy for everyone. But then it's also, after it meets the demand of just the state and municipal properties, it's going to offer to every customer across the state. Instead of you going with, for me, Con Edison, I could have the option of 100% renewable NYPA power at the same price or cheaper than Con Ed. That is something that will be offered. So it'd be a public option for energy there, and it would make energy a public good. And so it would do this by scaling up NYPA and being able to really kind of bring the energy back under public control and scale out. And the coolest thing about this is it's a Green New Deal in itself. It's a green stimulus in itself. It would create, New York State just passed a law a few weeks ago, which is really great. It promised that all renewable projects have to have union like labor for going forward in New York State. They have to have project labor agreements and neutrality clauses, meaning that it will be labor, or it's the strongest renewable labor language there is in the country. So that's great news. So now if that means we're having 35,000 jobs created by this Build Public Renewables Act, across the state, if NYPA just does 75% of what is offered and possible for them to do on the scaling out, 35,000 new jobs that are now have that guarantee that there'll be project labor agreement and unionized and being able to scale up in meeting this demand. New York State's right now at like 4,500 jobs in the fossil fuel economy. So if we're saying that nearly 10 times as many jobs are available in the building out of public renewables, why are we not doing that? And NYPA can be the one that funds it. It's really kind of what we're pushing for this session because it makes a ton of sense and it's something that kind of scales that up. Now, I just want to address the CCA question because I think if Connecticut had something like the New York Power Authority, like you would go for something like that. When you don't have that option, CCAs are the best thing you can do because you can band together and choose your source of energy. So the CCAs in New York City or in New York State we've worked with CCA groups in New York State to talk about this bill because we want CCAs to be able to plug right into that clean 100% renewable NYPA energy. And we want them to be able to work those rates to be cheaper. That's what CCAs do. And it's a really awesome idea and thing that works. And so like all of this, we want as much new energy and renewable energy on the grid as possible, because as you said, like we have a climate crisis. We need to meet these 2030 and 2040 targets. Well, whether it's large scale or small scale, we need it all to be renewable. We need to have as much of it for all of us. And we don't need new Yale LNG facilities, even if they're the cleanest LNG facility. We don't need new clean facilities. We need renewables, and we need to get that now and scale up to do so. And so that's kind of like the big thing about the Build Public Renewables Act. But the one thing about it is it doesn't do anything about these distribution utilities, because as I said, generation and transmission are split up in New York State. And so from distribution. And so we have a second bill that we're introducing this year, which will finish the job. And so it's called the New York Utility Democracy Act. It is not out yet. It'll be introduced in the upcoming weeks. But the Utility Democracy Act will take these for-profit corporate utilities, remove the CEOs in Wall Street, and bring them fully under public ownership within 2 years all across the state. Making them and taking their profits and reinvesting them in resiliency and the grid. Something that we see in New York City area all the time is Manhattan is it's where Wall Street is. It's the wealthiest part and the nicest. It's like the fanciest part of the country. It's the nicest part of, or the wealthiest part of the city. Manhattan undergrounded their entire energy grid in 1912, I believe. And so they never get blacked out. Manhattan never has blackouts. Yet Central Brooklyn, Southern Brooklyn, Southeast Queens, these communities are blacked out every storm we get. And so these kind of people in these areas are asked, like, what do you want? Well, can you bury the lines? Can you invest and put the lines underground? Because if a tree falls on it, it's going to be blacked out again next year. And the utility every time says, no, it's way too expensive. It's not something we can do. It's way too expensive. It's not something we can do. Mind you, Justin, hear this. This is the most wild part to me. Con Ed is guaranteed 9.75% on every dollar that they spend in return from ratepayers on any new investment that they make in capital. So if they did that work, they'd be guaranteed 10% return to them, guaranteed just for investing in themselves. But it doesn't make sense to do it for them because it's a lot of money up front and they run on a quarterly earnings pattern. So if they did it, while it would be making them money in the long term, they do worse next quarter. And that's not good for the shareholders. So they just don't invest in the grid at all. Instead, so what we're saying is we should have these publicly owned utilities. We should have democratic control, elected boards. We should have the people actually in charge of this and really bringing it under our control, and have the money, instead of going $9 million to a CEO or $1.3 billion to shareholders, going to the infrastructure grid, investing in our grid and upscaling what we need to build the 100% renewable energy that we need and the energy system that we need. We need to kind of we need to invest in that resilient grid. We need to end the toxic pollution, and we need to make it energy by the people for the people in rebuilding New York.
No, I 1,000% agree. I laugh because we have a very active group. One thing about Connecticut, people love their trees, right? We love our trees, and so
it's a great thing. I love trees too. It's like I wish I had more here in Brooklyn, to be honest. But yes, jealous of that.
But we fight every year with Eversource and with UI about undergrounding wires because the trees come down or they aggressively prune a tree and then they basically kill the tree. The tree ends up falling down on the lines or ends up falling down. And it's just like, we're spending so much money, so much time, so much effort when we could underground the wires.
Yep.
And just have beautiful, healthy trees.
It also looks prettier too, right?
And then we have the winters. It's just like energy company logic never makes sense to me because I'm like, all right, if there's a bad frost, if there's heavy winds, if the trees come down, it's just like, I don't understand how in your business models, somehow you've convinced yourselves that undergrounding wires just won't outweigh the long-term benefits, right? So I'm glad you brought that up because I was going to bring it up myself. And then I'm like, it's a universal issue.
Totally. The problem is the power of these the power of the energy system is enormous, but the corporations at the hands of it right now are only going to use that to kind of extort us and take the money to profit off of it. And so I know this is something that a lot of people ask about this, and I want to just like get out in front and talk about this because a lot of people say, oh, but is public ownership something that could be done, or is this something that could be better? And does this exist? And so first off, 1 in 7 Americans already get their power from a public utility already. There are a lot of rural electrical co-ops. There are the Tennessee Valley Authority. There's Austin Energy in Texas. There's Seattle has a public utility. There are public utilities and the entire state of Nebraska is actually a public utility and has fully democratically elected boards. Now, what I want to be clear about here is like, that does not mean that they're good. That does not mean that they're in good hands and that they have done well or have gone to renewables. But I do want to say that if I had the choice between a public utility or a private utility, I'm going to go with the one that I can make democratic 100% of the time, every day, all day. And so I think that's the thing, that we see public utilities as a path towards democratization and getting to the 100% renewable accountability that we need. And so there are these energy, and so Austin actually was better off than a lot of Texas because their bills didn't go up during that giant blizzard that happened, that freak blizzard that happened a couple of months ago. And New York City Water, I think, is a really good example of this, because under the NIUTA bill, there wouldn't be residential shutoffs anymore. Energy would be treated as a human right, not a privilege. It would be so that lights and keeping your lights on is not something that you have to worry about. It's something that's kind of guaranteed. And so people ask, well, how could you do that? Like, what about, why would you not have shutoffs? And like, we have New York City Water, which is some of the best water in the world. We don't have shutoffs for water if you can't afford it. There are payment plans, there are things that can happen, but shutting off electricity, and we saw this year how essential electricity is when everyone was home. How are we communicating right now? It's through our computers and internet. Shutting those essential services off is really just keeping people in the dark, but also denying them access and denying them the ability to kind of succeed in this 21st century world. And so we see energy as a public good and something that's worth fighting for in that way, in rebuilding not just New York's infrastructure, but the whole country. And I think there are some Congress people that are starting to see this as a public fight as well, and something that may come. I know it's definitely part of the Green New Deal, and it's something we should all kind of be viewing as a key fight. And while it's not generally the most simple or easy topic to get into, I think everyone understands that their bills seem too high on their energy bill, or there's something that they don't understand about it. And especially as we're supposed to wane ourselves off of gas, and we're going to need 30% more electricity on the grid total, so we don't have fossil fuels burning, we're going to need these fights to be central, because otherwise we're going to be extorted by the same corporations that got us into the problem to try to get us out, with Goldman Sachs renewable energy, rather than democratically controlled, publicly owned energy for New York State and this country.
It just makes me think of like the oil companies owning most of the patents for like electric cars. It's just like,
exactly.
who no, like that doesn't make sense. I seeing that today is Earth Day, and we are talking about the environment, and we kind of talked about these goals. You know, just can you share perspective with people on, you talked about, I used to visit New York all the time, and you talked about the lack of trees. Can you just kind of talk about like the tangible environmental effects of like cleaner energy? What
Sure.
do we have to look forward to?
Yeah, I think this is the thing that a lot of people frame these things in, like what you'll be giving up or what you'll be losing out on, rather than what we can gain. And like, I think, as I said, like there are 4,500 jobs in the fossil fuel industry in New York State. There's 35,000 jobs if NYPA just builds out the public renewable 75% of the way. Could be 50,000 jobs. That's renewable jobs, or jobs created in the creation of renewables. That's something to look forward to. The idea that communities that have been kind of disadvantaged through disinvestment, and communities, especially in the Rust Belt and all throughout kind of Northeast, a lot of Connecticut cities and towns, that they are dependent on one corporation or one company, and then that company leaves, or that company has a bad year and people's livelihoods are dependent on that. Well, if all of a sudden there's a lot of open space and wind or solar array, the place can become much more resilient, but also can start kind of getting money back for their community and bringing jobs back to the community, because these aren't just putting down a pipeline jobs. These are maintaining and kind of making sure that the renewable grid is up to par the entire time, and making sure that these turbines and everything and installations are up to everything. We're also going to need to do retrofits on all these old buildings, which are really great that we have such great housing stock here in the Northeast. but that means that we need to get them up to par for the winters that we're going to have and the heat that we're going to have in the summers, and making sure that these buildings kind of meet the 21st century that we need. We also have the ability at like not having toxic and environmentally redlined communities. We're not going to have like, if there's no peaker plants, and peaker plants are spew the worst, dirtiest energy, and they only come on the hottest days of the summer. If we don't have peaker plants, and peaker plants are all located in what are called environmental justice communities in New York City, and they're communities that have been chosen specifically to host these peaker plants because they were seen as by people back in the day as places where people were disposable. It's really disgraceful. And those communities have to deal with asthma rates higher than everything. They have to deal with all of these issues. And so as a result, if we don't have to have peaker plants and we can have renewable energy, kids can grow up without the fear of asthma. They can grow up without the fear of other environmental toxins in their food and in their air. And they can have cleaner, better air and water to eat and drink and live in, and really have greater recreation as well. There's a lot to look forward in this. And so we don't need to kind of limit ourselves to what is not available, but think about what we can gain from transitioning to the renewable energy economy that we need to, especially because the cost of doing nothing at it will only become worse. If we don't do anything, we know what's in the future for us. We know that climate catastrophe will just get worse and worse each year. We'll have storms, hurricanes, all of those things. So with the incentive to have a better world out of this, there's no better time than fighting for it than now on this Earth Day.
No, I thank you for sharing that. And the city of Bridgeport is actually has a peaker plant for New York City.
Oh, wow.
So it's not even a place like New York. I want to thank y'all for the advocacy you're doing, because it affects us, right? The natural gas line and the alliance that we did where Connecticut into Mass, these are issues that we're all affected, right? Like our grids, to your point, are not just where we are in our own communities, but they're regional. We share them together. So we got to do a better job educating each other.
And to that point, we're going to need jobs from Connecticut and jobs from New York to work together, because there's not one place in the U.S. right now that is built for the building out the renewables and building out the wind turbines and the solar panels that we're going to need. So there are jobs to be had, not just in New York. There are jobs to be had in regional supply chains, and working together will be even more essential, and it'll bring us closer together.
Facts. Well, as we near the end of our time, I just want to thank y'all for all the work you're doing, and I would be remiss because I didn't share my own energy plan that I got a ton of help from great thought partners like yourself. But is there any other thing that you want to share, or any other thing that you say, this is something that we really think about?
Yeah, I think the last thing I would say is, and this might not be thought of as a climate campaign generally, but is something that's extremely important right now, is there's a campaign for the PRO Act, which is going on the federal level right now. And the PRO Act would make it easier for people to unionize, make sure that workers were treated with dignity and respect, but would it also really make it so that when we do build out this Green New Deal world, that all these jobs are good paying union jobs and are ones where we can actually build out the world that we need and how to achieve it. And so it's something that I think right now there's 2 or 3 Democratic senators that are holding this up from passing. The president signaled support for it. And it's something that I think would help usher in the world we need. And so I would just like to shout out that campaign as well.
Cool. I don't even know if it's Joe Manchin, but we're just
so Joe Manchin just signed on to it. He signed on to it 2 days ago. And so it's really now just Mark Kelly, Kristen Sinema, and Mark Warner. It's just the 3 of them. And then but Joe Manchin signed on. And so if you're behind Joe Manchin, you got to step your game up.
All right. Well, Samia, just another one that always just seems to just be on the wrong side. So, yeah.
Well, Justin, this was a real treat, and I thank you so much. This was really awesome, and I thank you for your show and all your work, and I'm so excited to keep listening and checking out all the future episodes as well.
No, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aaron. This was really enlightening. I was just listening about the part that really struck me is when you said that even though Yale and his $33 billion, has its own power plant, they decided not to do renewable energy. Like, don't you talking about the cost? I mean, like, really, but isn't that fascinating how, like, I think it was, which state you said is all public electric, all public utility? Nebraska,
and it was done by Republicans too.
Isn't that like, oh my goodness. I've been listening to the program the whole time, and I've just been sitting there going, what? Can you believe that? So it's amazing. I thank you so much for your work, and please come back and keep us informed about all of the stuff that you're working on, because it's really amazing, how we can, reduce asthma and the breathing problems and the health problems. It's really important work.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And I really thank you both. And I hope you have a great rest of your Earth Day.
Yes, thank you.